Hello and greetings. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. When the Atlantic Council launched its Iran task force 7 years ago, co-chaired by Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and our then chairman, former Senator, now former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, we correctly anticipated that U.S. relations with Iran would become an ever more significant. That was both because of Iran's crucial regional role and what was, at the time, a rapidly advancing nuclear program. 2 years ago, it seemed the nuclear issue had been dealt with, if primarily along partisan lines and not to the satisfaction of all, through the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. While senior Trump administration officials and other parties to the agreement believe Iran has abided by JCPOA, President Trump has expressed his displeasure with its terms. At the UN General Assembly last week, he called it, quote, an embarrassment to the United States, unquote, and said the U.S. could not abide by an agreement if, quote, it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program, unquote. Without yet saying what might be proposed or done, he told the General Assembly it had not heard the last of it. What we hear from the administration is a particular disquiet with the sunset arrangements and also with Iranian misbehavior in the region generally, which he has signaled on many occasions, wanting a desire to push back on what he has called the destabilizing activities Iran has undertaken across the Middle East. While the Obama administration believes the nuclear agreement was a significant step forward in and of itself and for its own rights, President Trump has focused a great deal more on Iran's policies and behavior beyond the agreement, in concert with traditional U.S. Arab allies. Without knowing exactly where U.S. policy will land, both in terms of Iran's actions in the region and JCPOA, we do know that this is a changed context and a changing context for our meeting today. JCPOA, as those in this room know, and I see quite a few experts and knowledgeable individuals here in the room, was not a bilateral but a multilateral agreement, and European countries, Britain, France, and Germany, and also the European Union, were crucial players in the agreement and the negotiations. So we're delighted to have the ambassadors of France, of Germany, and of the UK here today, and also of the European Union for this extremely timely event. So Ambassador Wittig, we won't be discussing the elections. And so, Kim, we won't be talking about Brexit today. So, but we will be talking about this very important agreement. It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Eizenstat for some further remarks. Stu is one of our country's most accomplished public servants and one of the Atlantic Council Board's most significant leaders. Let me thank you in front of everyone, Stu, for everything you've done on this project, but in general, everything else you do for the Atlantic Council as well. With the conclusion of JCPOA, the task force evolved in January 2016 an advisory board, which Stu still chairs. And it provides guidance and support to our Future of Iran initiative, which is so ably directed by Barbara Slavin. So with that, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fred. The Atlantic Council's Future of Iran initiative began life as the Iran Task Force organized under the co-chairmanship of Chuck Hagel, later Secretary of Defense, and myself, and led throughout by Barbara Slavin. Over the years, we've had more than 100 events. We've published more than 24 papers. We've examined Iran's regional activities, its nuclear program, its domestic politics, its record on human rights, its economy. Following implementation of the JCPOA last year, our task force morphed into the Iran Advisory Board, still under my chairmanship and under the directorship of Barbara. This recognized the pivotal role that Iran plays in the region and anticipates the need for American policymakers and Americans in general to understand Iran better in order to formulate pragmatic solutions to regional crises. Last May, we presented 8 papers on ways to bolster the JCPOA, and earlier this month, we had a panel discussion on scientific exchanges with Iran and the importance of maintaining people-to-people ties. We hope that our work assists the Trump administration, Congress, and the American people in formulating thoughtful and successful U.S. policies toward Iran. With the negotiation and implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we had hoped we could focus on the future of U.S.-Iran relations as bolstered by the agreement. As it turns out, this may not be the case. On its side, Iran has continued its missile development, its support for Hezbollah and other terrorist groups, its intervention in Syria in ways that are very counterproductive, and its bad human rights policy. But, on the other hand, it has faithfully implemented, according to the IAEA, the JCPOA, and before that, the interim nuclear agreement in 2013. It now appears that Washington, rather than Iran, may be a bigger threat to the JCPOA. As the sunset clauses in the JCPOA approach, it is indeed perfectly reasonable to consider a follow-up agreement. But the way to get there is not by threatening to tear up something that's curbing Iran's ability in the near term to develop nuclear programs for at least the next decade. Europe has and will continue to play a critical role in determining the future of the JCPOA and, more directly and more broadly, relations with Iran. We look forward to hearing the views of the EC3 and the EU ambassadors today about how to navigate the challenges, and particularly so because we are approaching another certification date by the President, and as Fred indicated, he's indicated he may not certify, and therefore the role of Europe becomes even more central. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Barbara Slavin, who's been our really catalyst now for 7 years on this important program.
Thank you, Ambassador Eizenstat. You have been a wonderful supporter of this program and a wonderful guide for it. Thank you all for coming. I guess there's some interest in this issue today, judging from the size of the crowd. Throughout the history of the nuclear negotiations with Iran, going back to 2002, when Iran's nuclear activities were revealed, Europe has played a pivotal role in these negotiations. They began with the E3 and the European Union at a time when the Bush administration refused to talk to Iran and called it a member of the Axis of Evil. Over the years, the U.S. became more involved in the negotiations, but the European role has remained crucial. And now, with the JCPOA increasingly challenged, as Ambassador Eizenstat said, from Washington, rather than Iran, it may be up to the Europeans again to save the deal and, if possible, build on it. So we are delighted that we have today with us 4 extraordinary diplomats, many of whom have a lot of personal experience dealing with this issue. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. I see that Gérard Araud has just appeared, the Ambassador of France to the United States. He's a career diplomat. He has graced us with his presence in Washington for 3 years now. He previously held numerous positions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, among them ambassador to Israel, France's permanent representative to the UN, and the French negotiator on the Iranian nuclear issue from 2006 to 2009. Sir Kim Darroch presented his credentials as the ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States in January 2016, just after the JCPOA went into full implementation. And his career spans 3 decades, has been primarily focused on national security issues and European Union policy. He served as National Security Advisor for the UK. He led the national security team on issues ranging from the rise of Daesh in Iraq and Syria to Russian aggression in the Ukraine and the Iranian nuclear issue. And he also served as UK Permanent Representative to the European Union and as EU Advisor to the Prime Minister. David O'Sullivan is with us today. He is the ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to the United States. He was posted here in November 2014. As the EU's top diplomat to the United States, he oversees the bilateral relationship with the U.S. and the direction and work of the EU delegation. He also was Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, and he was really responsible for helping to establish this new EU diplomatic service. So I'm looking forward to hearing his remarks. And finally, last but not least, Peter Wittig has served as German ambassador to the U.S. since April 2014. Prior to that, he was the ambassador to the UN. He's also served in Madrid as private secretary to the foreign minister and as ambassador in Lebanon and in Cyprus. So we could not have asked for a more distinguished panel, and believe me, it was not easy to get all of these people here at this time. We're also delighted that C-SPAN is covering us, and we ask you all, if you're in the tweeting mood, to feel free to tweet at #ACIran. And with that, let me invite our panelists up to the stage. I have to say, I wish there were another lady up here, but what can we do?
Gender balance.
Gender.
Referred to Federica Mogherini's remarks, and I'd like to touch on those because there was a meeting of the Joint Commission at ministerial level in New York, and I think it's important to recall what Federica Mogherini said at the end of that meeting. I mean, the first was to recall what this agreement is about. It is an agreement about nuclear non-proliferation. It is designed to make sure that Iran will not ever have nuclear weapons. That is what it set out to do. That was the purpose of it. That was the basis of the negotiation, and it has achieved that purpose. This is one of the most comprehensive non-proliferation agreements ever negotiated, with unprecedented scrutiny and monitoring of the arrangement in ways that frankly have never been seen before. So it is a groundbreaking non-proliferation agreement, which we believe, if fully implemented by all sides, will effectively make sure that Iran never obtains nuclear weapons. This is in itself a remarkable achievement, and would have the opposite, would have hugely negative consequences for the region. The other point to bear in mind is, as you said, that this is not a bilateral agreement. It is a multilateral agreement, and indeed now an agreement, as Federica Mogherini said, which belongs to the international community. It has been enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, and it is now a public good of the global community. And it is the global community that expects all parties who have signed up to this agreement to implement it and to do so fully. And the final and most important point is that indeed the agreement is being implemented. There was absolutely no disagreement about this point in the ministerial meeting last week. Iran is fully living up to its commitments. It's been certified 8 times by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it has been confirmed just recently again. So this agreement is delivering on a very, very important objective, which is to ensure that Iran does not possess nuclear weapons. And the view of the European Union is that this agreement is a success, needs to be maintained, nurtured, needs to be strictly scrutinized to make sure that everyone, and that includes all the people who have signed up to this agreement, deliver on their commitments in order to make sure that this global public good of non-proliferation in the Middle East region is maintained.
You didn't answer my question. What will you do if the U.S. walks away?
I don't answer hypothetical questions of that kind. We have to see. No, Barbara, let's be frank. There is a debate going on here in the United States.
Mrs. Mogherini did say that Europe would continue to abide by this agreement as long as Iran did.
We will continue to abide by this agreement as long as the agreement remains in force and continues to function. We are fully supportive of this agreement, and we believe that this agreement, the eventual demise of this agreement, would be a major loss. And by the way, we will perhaps want to talk later about some of the other issues we have with Iran in the region.
Sure.
But I can think of no regional issue that we have with Iran that would not be even more difficult to handle if Iran possessed nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So difficult as some of those issues are, one of the most important contributions of this agreement is to take nuclear weapons out of the equation.
Right. Ambassador Araud, your president, Mr. Macron, has come up with an idea for some sort of follow-on negotiations. But it would seem that those are predicated on the JCPOA surviving. They're not a substitute for them, are they?
No. First, of course, I do agree to everything David just said. The negotiation of the nuclear agreement has been conducted in isolation from other issues, and it was done on purpose. The issue was so technical, so complicated, so critical, that we didn't want to be dragged into a sort of quid pro quo between nuclear issues and other issues. So it has been it's a nuclear deal. But isolation works both ways, which means that nothing in the agreement is preventing us from facing the challenges, I should say, raised by Iran on other issues. And it's exactly what my president said repeatedly in New York. We have, I think, we are raising a lot of questions about what Iran is doing, as Ambassador Eizenstat was saying, in Syria, or as for support of terrorist activity, or the missiles in Yemen. And we have said that we are ready to work with our allies, here and allies in the region, to be up to the challenge, to the Iranian challenge. The second point is what is called the sunset clause, or which means not 2025, by the way, it's more 2030. The first thing that we have to emphasize is that, contrary to what I've heard in some circles, after this agreement, Iran will be a full member of the NPT and will implement the additional protocol, which means that Iran will not have the right of getting nuclear weapons. I think it's a very important element. And if Iran was conducting activities inconsistent with the NPT and the additional protocol, we will be, of course, in a position to impose back sanctions. So we are not going suddenly in 2025 or 2030 in a sort of Far West. We have rules. There is a treaty. We have strong monitoring instruments, and they will be there. Having said that, what my president said on this last point was that we are ready to discuss with our partners what will be the situation, what does it mean in terms of transfer of technologies, for instance, towards Iran, which has and will have the right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. What does it mean in terms of security? Nothing more, but of course the basis is the full implementation of the Iran deal as it is.
Ambassador Kim, Sir Kim, if I may. Your Prime Minister met with President Trump last week. I understand he did not reveal his decision to her, but perhaps you have a good idea of what he's going to do. What is your sense of that, and how will the UK react?
Sounds like you were there, Barbara. First of all, thanks to the United Council for organising this event, which is extremely timely. Yes, Prime Minister and the President had about 50 minutes together on Wednesday afternoon in New York. They talk a lot. They'd talked previously only about a week beforehand on the telephone, and they have a very good personal relationship, so it's a very free and easy-flowing conversation. They spent probably half the time on Iran. The President, you're right, did not say what he was going to do on the 16th of October, but he did explain at length what he doesn't like about the deal and why he thinks it's deficient, it's flawed. And the Prime Minister, I have to say, agreed with him on Iranian activities in the region, on what they're doing in terms of supporting Hezbollah, supporting the Houthis in Yemen, supporting Assad in Syria, and the importance of pushing back on all of that. And she put forward some ideas which we will follow up on how we can do that better than we've done hitherto. But in terms of the JCPO, she explained again why we support it, which is, by the way, it's about our national security. We think we are more secure because of this deal, and that's why, as long as the Iranians continue to comply with it in the view of the IAEA, we will continue to support it.
You're also not quite answering the question, so I will now toss it down the line to Ambassador Wittig. Are you prepared for decertification by the US? What would that imply? And here, not just for the German government, and congratulations, by the way, on the re-election of Mrs. Merkel. What would it imply for German businesses who are going back into Iran in a fairly significant way now with the relief of many of the US sanctions?
Thank you, Barbara, for having us here in the Atlantic Council, and thank you for following this over the years so closely. Such an important issue. It's very high on my mental agenda, but I admit also Germany after the elections is also something that keeps my mind spinning. Now, let me just say what our national position is and the EU position. We are interested, and this is actually a high priority, in the continued success of the Iranian nuclear deal. That's an EU position, that's a very high German foreign policy and security policy position. This nuclear deal is worth preserving. It prevents Iran for the foreseeable future to acquire a nuclear bomb. It's a plus for regional security, it's a plus for global security. And it can't be said enough. This is the most intrusive, the most comprehensive inspection, verification regime in the world that this Iranian deal created. And Iran, that's also important to note, according to the International Atomic Agency, complied with the deal. Now, those who would like to walk away, I'm not saying the US administration has decided to walk away, but those who want to walk away or advocate to walk away, they will have to think about the larger issues. First of all, of course, there is then the danger that Iran resumes its enrichment activity. There is a danger then that there will be a nuclear arms race in the region and beyond. And that's very important and goes beyond the Iranian issue, that it weakens essentially the non-proliferation regime that we have established over the years. And last but not least, what kind of signal would this send to countries like North Korea? It would send a signal that diplomacy is not reliable. that you can't trust diplomatic agreements. And that would affect, I believe, our credibility in the West when we are not honoring an agreement that Iran has not violated. So, let me say 2 sentences more. Those who advocate walking away from this agreement, I'm not saying that this administration has decided to walk away, but there are people in this country, interesting enough, not in our countries. There is no challenge in, if I am correct, in our respective countries to this agreement. It's just the US, for historic reasons, a US phenomenon. But those who advocate to walk away from this agreement have to come up with an alternative how to prevent, in a peaceful way, a resuming of Iranian nuclear capabilities and military capabilities. And those who advocate to renegotiate it, and there are some who do, have to make a case whether renegotiation is possible and whether renegotiation will deliver better results. And I think that is yet to prove. We don't think it will be possible to renegotiate it, and we believe there is no practical, peaceful alternative to this deal. Last sentence. We respect that this administration is reviewing the Iran file. It's, the respectful, we're respectful about that. It's a natural thing to do for a new administration. And we share concerns about Iran's nefarious role in the region, Iran's missile program, etc. And we can talk about it, but on the basis of complying with this agreement.
Let me just ask one more, and then we have some very experienced experts in the audience, and I'm going to turn to them quickly. In terms of the meeting that took place last week, my understanding is that basically each side stated its position, that there wasn't very much interaction between Rex Tillerson and Javad Zarif. Is that correct? Did you get any sense from that meeting that there was hope for the Joint Commission to remain an important decision-making body in the JCPOA, or is it likely to be simply overtaken by events in the United States?
Well, I wasn't there, so I cannot give you details of the nature of the exchanges. I mean, I think you need to understand the function of the Joint Commission is simply to monitor and to oversee the implementation of the agreement. And the conclusion was that the agreement is being correctly implemented and that it is going forward in the way which is intended. And to me, this is the absolutely crucial issue here. This is such an important agreement, but we all agree that its correct implementation is fundamental. There are other discussions, there are other issues which are out there, and we know that, as a number of the colleagues have mentioned, these are important. They are important politically for the United States, for the rest of us in the region. But I repeat, dealing with those issues against the backdrop of a successful implementation of the JCPOA, which puts nuclear weapons out of the equation, is a very different situation than trying to do so in a situation where Iran could be once again pursuing the acquisition of nuclear weapons.
So,
on this point,
yes.
Considering the debate which is ongoing in Washington, D.C., I think during this meeting there was a very clear message, and going into the direction of what just Peter said, coming from Iran, from China and Russia, saying no way, there won't be any reopening of the agreement. The agreement is working as it is.
Let me ask you then whether you sensed any willingness to have follow-on negotiations or other discussions within this format or another format. Your president also has a very good relationship with Donald Trump and seems to be able to talk to him easily.
And thanks to us, you are going to have a military parade on July the 4th on Penn Avenue.
Apparently,
I think once more the civilizing mission of France has been a success.
Maybe we can combine Bastille Day and July 4th. Did he have any success in convincing him of this? Do you see this as a way to keep the U.S. in the JCPOA? And really for all of you, and I'll direct this after you to Sir Kim and also to Ambassador Wittig, I mean, from the very beginning, you have been telling this administration, keep the Iran deal. Do you have any sense that your message is getting through?
Is that
Yes.
addressed to me? My chancellor was an absentee last week in New York. She was not at the opening of the GA week, the General Assembly week, because she had some campaigning to do. So she was not there in person. I think she will speak with the president on the Iran issue in the coming days. So there's nothing more I can say about the results.
Shall I?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't for a second claim that the Prime Minister believed that she had, as it were, persuaded the President to stick with it. Though, as I said earlier, he said he wasn't going to say at that meeting what position he would eventually take. But both he and the Vice President was there, and Rex Tillerson were interested in our ideas about ways in which we could push back against Iranian activities in the region, whether in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, or Iraq, and interested in our ideas about using all of the powers, inspection powers, in the JCPOA more effectively, and in starting at some point, within the context of this agreement, talks with Iranians on what Gérard has mentioned on the sunset clauses and what comes next. So yes, there was good engagement on those issues, but do I think we have changed the President's mind? I think we'll wait and see what happens on the 15th of October.
Okay, with that, let me open and wait for the microphone, say your name, and ask a question, because we want to get as many of these in as we can. So do we have someone who can pass the mics around? Yeah? We have right here to start. Thank you so much. Yeah, right here. And then Laura Rosen after that. Yeah. Okay. And then Laura.
Hi, thank you for doing this. Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. In the event that the president does decertify Iran, the backstop could be Republicans in Congress. Do you have any outreach in them, including to the majority leaders of the Republican Party in the House and Senate? Is your message to them basically the message that you have stated today?
Is that directed toward a particular ambassador, or who wants to?
Anybody.
Just to say, we have been talking to figures in Congress, in Senate and House for months now about this, and we've intensified that in the last few weeks. It's not about saying to them, if the president does this, you do this. It is about explaining to them why we support the deal, why we think it's in our British national security interest for it to be sustained, and why we think it has had such a profound effect on Iran's nuclear program. So it's about going through all the details and all the substance and explaining why we think what we think. And yes, we will certainly continue to do that, and as the crunch point arrives, no doubt, do a lot more of it.
And actually, we have been doing it also in this format. Really going, meeting our interlocutors on the Hill as the E3 plus the European Union.
Very good. Laura, right here. Yeah, thanks.
From Al Monitor, and Barbara, thanks for hosting this excellent panel. Whoever wants to take it, the Trump administration seems to think if Trump decertifies and passes it to Congress, that even before Congress may pass new sanctions, they will have more leverage on you all to either agree to renegotiate or, it seems, toughen proposals you already are saying you're willing to talk about by way of follow-on agreements. Is that correct? Will you all be giving more if Trump decertifies? Thanks.
Or giving less because you're angry at him. Ambassador O'Sullivan.
Well, look, it's not that we don't want to answer the question. We wait, like as Kim and others have said, we wait to see. We wait to see what happens, and we wait to see what is the political explanation of what happens, so that we can better understand what people are trying to achieve. But so far as we are concerned, the agreement is working. There is no need to amend it, to renegotiate it, or to change it, as long as it continues to function effectively. And that is the unanimous position on the European side. On the other issues, as has been said, we are very open to discussing with the US how we can address those. I mean, we on the European side, Iran is one of the countries against whom we still have, I think it's the third most sanctioned country in European Union activity. So we still have sanctions on human rights, on the ballistic missiles issue, and even on the nuclear issue, because we haven't lifted all our sanctions until the final implementation of the agreement. So, I mean, but we share the concerns about these issues. And Federica Mogherini said, you will have noticed at the press conference, that if it is deemed helpful to have a sort of multilateral discussion of these issues in a similar format, why not? But it's important not to mix this with the correct implementation of an agreement which has its own logic and its own objective.
And I want to add, once for all, decertification, certification, it's a domestic issue. It's an American issue. It's your issue.
Right.
You know, really, what matters for us will be the consequences of that, if there is any. And you know it will be to the Congress to decide. So we are not going to criticize the president for certification or decertification. That's your problem.
So, to add one point on this, which is that what you have noticed, or I've noticed over the past 2 or 3 months, is a genuine and really quite serious intensification of contacts amongst us Europeans, but also with the experts in this administration, on how to increase the pressure on Iran, on what we might do about the sunset clauses, what we might do about intensifying inspections, and what we might do about what Iran is doing in the region. So, in a sense, what this administration has been saying since it came into office has changed the climate already on Iran. So it's succeeding.
Yes.
And we would say, let's carry on with that, let's intensify our discussions, let's take some decisions on the way forward on all these issues, but let's keep the JCPOA. That way, you both keep the non-proliferation basis for going, but you find ways collectively of working on Iranian activities in the region.
Can I add something? It has been said, rightly so, that we share a lot of the American concerns, regional behavior. Stu mentioned this, the nefarious role Iran plays in Syria or in Yemen, etc. What has not been mentioned, we're talking to Iranians about this, and in a pretty robust way. We all have embassies there. That's a plus. And as far as we are concerned as Germans, we have contacts across the board of this very diverse Iranian political spectrum and society. So we are actually doing our utmost with our tools that we have, including putting pressure on Iran.
One could actually argue that if the U.S. decertifies or walks away in some way, it's losing the leverage it now has, not only over Iran, but over you. Yes? To have this more sort of forward-leaning position against
Again,
Iran.
decertifying is not the threshold. But if the U.S. would walk away from this agreement, it would lose tools to monitor and inspect, and would lose tools of transparency, what is happening on the ground, and that would be a tremendous loss.
Right there, in the middle. Wait for the microphone. Yeah. No, behind you. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much. Ahmed Majidiyar from the Middle East Institute. Your relations with Iran have significantly improved since the signing of the Iran deal 2 years ago. If the Trump administration leaves the deal unilaterally, how would that impact your trade and diplomatic relations with the Islamic Republic?
Anybody?
I mean, could I just say, from our point of view, not really. UK-Iran trade last year, I think, was about 200, our exports to Iran were about 200 million, which is something like 0.3% of our total exports, and not significantly more than we exported 10 years ago. I mean, I think there are probably houses in London that cost more than we sell to Iran. So we haven't had a huge boost in bilateral relations. We've opened up an embassy. They've opened one in London. We've exchanged ambassadors. And of course, the objective here is to take things further and develop a stronger relationship. Iran's activities are one of the constraints on that. There are other constraints bilaterally, but the idea there has been a huge boost in relations, at least as far as the UK concerned, isn't the case.
Ambassador Araud, Total has now invested $5 billion in Iran.
I think I want to remind our American friends that when we started to impose sanctions on Iran, the US didn't have any trade with Iran. So it means that just because of the relationship between the two countries, which means that the sanctions actually, the burden of the sanctions have been carried by the Europeans. Really, because we had normal, really normal trade relationship with Iran. So it's, it's like with Russia also. I remind also my American friends that our trade with Russia, it's much more important than the US trade with Russia. So that we, the Europeans, we are carrying the burden of the sanctions. Really, because behind your question, there is always, this idea of saying, the Europeans are mercantile. We have shown in a very, very strong way in this crisis that we were not mercantile. And after that, after having signed the agreement, we are simply going back to trade relations, to a normal trade relationship with Iran. I think that's a normal part and a logical consequence of the agreement. So I think that if there was a crisis, we'll see what is the consequence. Our companies are making their decision on the basis of their own calculation of their interest.
Mm-hmm. And there are one or two American companies that are also doing quite well.
Yes, American companies are also,
I want to corroborate here what Gérard says. In our case, our economic relations go back decades, if not centuries. I think German companies have dealt with Iran even at the Qajar dynasty before the Shah came in. So, and those were very strong bounds. And we have suffered. German companies have suffered billions and billions and billions of dollars because we imposed, the EU imposed sanctions. And that's something not to be forgotten here. Now we normalize the situation. And again, I want to support what Gérard said. Dealing with Iran after the lifting of the sanctions is a legitimate and desirable goal of this JCPOA. Why? Because it potentially binds us closer together. Of course, it's good business. So, as for Boeing, it's good business to sell airplanes to Iran. That's a logic. But the other logic is that we hope and believe that in the end, it will be conducive to a better relationship to Iran, to have it in the international economic fold and not sideline it and not bring it down economically. Because this is a very vibrant civil society. It's a very young society. More than 50% of the population are under 30 years of age. It's a country with a future. It's 80 million people. You can't just wish it away. It's there to stay. And we want this Iran to gradually move to our values, to our worldview. And trade is an instrument, and interaction with the society is an instrument, and we think it's a good thing.
Okay. Darrell, right here. Wait,
he had his hand up too. So.
Okay, well, first you, and then everybody we have lots of time. Go.
Great. Daryl Kimball, Arms Control Association, thanks for putting this together. I have a question for Ambassador Araud, since you have such a long experience and memory on this issue. As you said, if President Trump fails to certify under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, that is our problem. Many of us recognize that. There will be a debate in Congress, and one thing it could do is to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions, but then it becomes your problem because those sanctions will have an effect, the secondary sanctions, on European firms. One of the things that the EU did in the 90s in connection with the Iran Sanctions Act then was to put in place a regulation that protected European banking and institutions and companies from those sanctions. So my question is, Is that an option that you have, in theory, in the event that those secondary sanctions are reimposed, even if Iran is still in compliance with the nuclear elements of the agreement?
You know, frankly, I think I could say, you know, I don't answer to hypothetical questions. But unfortunately, usually I answer to hypothetical questions.
That's why I asked you.
Even if I have instructions not to, I suppose. You know, really. No, first, what will matter at the end of the day is whether the US basically will walk from the agreement. And so the question will be if sanctions are imposed and which sanctions, you know, really there are a lot of different scenarios, whether it will in fact be walking out of the agreement. And that it will be to each of our countries and together to decide it. And there will be, I'm sure, that Iranians will simply go to the Joint Commission. You know, really, there is a Joint Commission about checking or discussing the implementation of the agreement between the E3+3 and with Iran. And the Iranians will complain about saying, you know, that's totally against the agreement. So there will be a discussion. After that, there will be also, which is important, what consequence Iran will draw from it. You know, and what will be extremely embarrassing for us, I suppose, and more than embarrassing, will be that if Iran says, I'm not going to implement the agreement anymore because the US is not implementing its side of the agreement. And that will be the real $1 million question for all of us. We, the strong allies of the US, but also we are committed to this agreement. We are convinced that the agreement is implemented right now. What will be our reaction? And as you can guess, it will be decided at the highest level in our capitals on the basis of precise elements.
As I recall, though, in the late 90s, you resisted secondary sanctions and threatened to take the U.S.
By
to the
definition,
WTO,
we don't like extraterritorial sanctions because we think it's illegal. What the sanctions really against Russia recently are a good example, you know, really. So that's, but again, the main question will be first a political question, the agreement itself.
Okay, right here, and then or Trita, actually, we'll go to Trita next, and then, or this guy and then Trita, okay.
Gardner Harris of the New York Times. So there are lots of critics of the deal who say essentially that your no of not renegotiating the deal isn't really a no, that you don't really mean it when you say no. And in fact, there's this sense that if the U.S. doesn't pressure you to come to some sort of agreement on things that they don't like about the deal, the sunset provisions, the fact that it doesn't cover ballistic missiles, regional things, if they don't get you to agree to how to deal with those things now, you're going to get all squishy because you're going to get much more economic relations with Iran, and you won't do what we want you to do in 10 years. So we need to get you to do it now because you'll get squishy later.
Because
so can you talk about...
to John Bolton?
Or can you, well, if you want, I can actually quote an email from Mark Dubowitz right now.
Oh, Mark Dubowitz. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
These are prominent critics say you have to use the credible threat of walking away from the deal to get the Europeans to do what they otherwise will not do, which is deal with these issues now instead of punting them off a decade. At that point, Iran will be close to a lethal state, and you guys will be squishier. So can you help?
Who's the squishiest person on the panel? I don't know.
Was there a question mark at the end of that?
We should preface this. We should say that Mark Dubowitz has been a harsh critic of this agreement from the very start, and has yet to come up with a substitute for it that would work.
Doing this administration very closely. Ambassador Araud, how do you respond to that?
The problem is that even if, you know, as you know, during the negotiation, we were not totally satisfied by some parts of the agreement. We have decided at the end of the negotiation, looking at it globally, we said it was a good agreement because to reach its goals, you know, really. But now, reopening an agreement, it means it takes two to tango. As I have told you, neither the Iranians, nor the Russians, nor the Chinese really are saying that there could be a reopening of the negotiation. And I don't know why the Iranians will say, we are going to reopen the negotiation so you can impose on me more constraints. Frankly, it doesn't make any sense. Reopening the negotiation, it's a non-starter, and and trying to get it, it's a dead end. You know, really, it's very clear. Even if you try, you know, obviously you are considering that the free Europeans, you know, have the status of being, you know, I don't know what for the U.S. But even if we were caving in, you know, to the friendly pressure of the U.S., basically we are not the problem in there. The problem here will be China, Russia, and Iran. You know, really. So please don't try to look upon the Europeans in this matter. We have an agreement. We have signed it. We are engaged by this agreement. There is also a question of credibility. How do you want to have an agreement with North Korea, as was said previously, if we are reneging on our own commitments?
Well, I just want to add something. You know, we are practitioners here. This was a multilateral agreement with difficult partners, most difficult Iran, but then difficult partners as China and Russia. We have multilateral experience here negotiating with those partners. You can never get a deal with this group of countries that will satisfy you 100%. It's always less than perfect. And anybody who says we get the perfect deal with those kind of partners is just dreaming. This is just in the logic of a multilateral negotiating process with countries with divergent interests. And I think the fact that this worked, I wouldn't say it was a miracle, but it was a very difficult accomplishment. And you should never underestimate what kind of skills, political acumen, patience, pressure, and intellectual capacity went into that deal. And it's one of the most complex ones. Once you start to unravel it, you know, you have to think twice.
If I could just
Please.
add a couple of points. I mean, we know Mark well, and we've debated this issue with him several times. He was around for breakfast actually last week, and we were talking about it. And he speaks very compellingly on it from his viewpoint, but we don't agree with him. And the idea that the Europeans want to sit by for a decade and can't be pressed into doing anything about all the other things that's wrong with Iranian policy, unless there is some crisis that is generated, is just it's not the way things are. We are coming all the time to this administration with ideas and policies. Gérard's talked about President Macron's ideas, talked about Prime Minister May's. We're talking all the time about ways of doing this, and it's much more, in a way, much more immediate for us, because what happens in Syria plays directly into refugee flows into Europe. What happened in Yemen can have the same effect. You know, these problems are on our doorsteps. The idea that we would just sit by for a decade and just make money out of trade with Iran and need to somehow be forced into taking these issues seriously. These issues matter to us, to our national security, more than you can imagine, point one. Point two, it's really to follow on from Peter's point. I mean, if you remember how things were in September 2012, when the Iranians had 19,000 centrifuges, they had 8,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, they had a heavy water plant that provided them with a plutonium route to nuclear material. They have shipped out 14 tons, I think, of enriched material. All their 20% enriched stuff has gone. They're to a limit of 300 kilograms. They stripped out 13,000 of their centrifuges. They have concreted over their heavy water reactor. I mean, these are real and huge advances as a product of this deal. So, you know, no wonder we all support it, and we think that it is important to our national security that it's maintained.
I would also add that I think Mark Dubowitz is frustrated because he knows that any reimposition of sanctions without European buy-in is not going to be effective. It was only when the United States, the European Union joined with the United States, stopped importing Iranian oil and imposed strict sanctions that Iran really felt the pain. And I think he's looking to try to recreate that, and that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to recreate as long as Iran is abiding by the agreement. Trita, you're next.
Trita Parsi, National Iranian American Council. Thank you so much, Barbara, for putting together this excellent and very timely panel. I was fascinated by the assessment that these threats of decertification has caused a deeper conversation within the EU partners about how to push back against Iranian activities in the region. I would like to know, are those conversations about pursuing additional negotiations and trying to find diplomatic solutions to those issues, mindful of the fact that the only time we have seen a remarkable change in Iranian policies it's been coupled with a Western change in policies as well? Or was it used more in the Washingtonian sense, in which pushing back means sanctions, pressure, potentially military action in a limited sense? And if it is the latter, what is the assessment of the EU of the JCPOA being able to survive if it's going to be coupled with more tensions in the region between the West and Iran?
Ambassador Sullivan, you take that one.
Well, I think it's more likely to be the former than the latter. I mean, it is a question of engagement. These are complex issues in the region. There are different interests at stake. We have, as Kim and Gérard and Peter have said, we have European national security interests in bringing more stability to the region, in addressing these issues. But I mean, it is all about taking the nuclear issue out of the equation and then having a discussion about how we push back. Sometimes it may involve some sanctions. We do have sanctions on some of these issues. Sometimes it may involve diplomacy. Sometimes it may involve dealing with the regional issues. It's a multi-layered strategy that we need to address these issues. They are complex and not always simple, but we believe that they must be addressed and they should be addressed, but that this should not cut across the issue of this agreement, which is absolutely fundamental to changing the basic dynamic, as Kim has just suggested, and taking the nuclear issue off the table. And then you move forward to see how and with what different measures from the toolbox you use to try and address the other issues, on which we also have similar concerns.
I think I want to correct a point. It has nothing to do with certification or non-certification. France has had this conversation about Iranian politics, Iranian policy in the Middle East with the previous administration. Really, the problem that we are facing in the Middle East is a geopolitical unbalance. Actually of not the making by Iran, but with the invasion of Iraq and with the Syrian civil crisis, there is a general geopolitical unbalance. And in a sense, Iran is taking, really is using it, as I think any regime will do it in this position. So the question that we have, the basic question that we have, is to define a new balance in the region. Of course, it has to be read in the different aspects of that, for instance, in Syria, and so on. But as we have said, the negotiation of the agreement has been in isolation from other issues. The isolation is going both ways. Nothing in the agreement is preventing us from raising the other issues. France has been doing it for at least since the signature of the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just say on 3 quick points? I think it's a mix of a series of different areas of policy and activity. One is, obviously, we need some political processes to resolve some of the conflicts in the region, of which, say, Yemen is obvious one we need a political process started, and where the Houthis, backed by the Iranians, are, by the way, the main problem. So we need to put more diplomatic energy into that. Second, I think there may be more things we can do down the sanctions route. For example, if you look at the way the IRGC is using its proxies across the region to kind of take forward Iranian policy, we wonder if there are things you can do if you know more about the financial flows that are financing these activities around the region, whether things you can do with sanctions there. Third thing, quickly, we need collectively strategies. It's almost a case of coping with success. As we push ISIL back in Syria, that leaves a vacuum, it leaves a space. Do you want Assad's forces backed by Iran in that space, or are there alternatives that we can work out to fill that? That's not the only instance, but that's one of the instances around the region where we need to work together and have a political strategy for countering what the Iranians might be able to do in future.
Very good. Yes, right here, Sina. Right here, on the aisle. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, from the ambassadors. Sina Azori, University of South Florida. Question, if the Congress decides to reimpose the nuclear sanctions, what will your response be? Is EU ready to impose its own laws protecting European firms doing business with Iran? Thank you.
I think you've all sort of talked about that before, but I mean, it's not clear that Congress would reimpose sanctions, too. It would set up a whole process, right, of 60 days in which they can decide what to do. And
yeah, I mean, we have, as was said earlier, we have the blocking statute, which was actually adopted in reaction to sanctions originally against Cuba, which does offer legal protection to European companies which are threatened by the extraterritorial nature of US sanctions in certain circumstances. And I've no doubt that if this scenario materializes, which it's not clear it will, the European Union will act to protect the legitimate interests of our company with all the means at our disposal. But I repeat, we wait to understand what is going to be decided, why it is decided, and what is the political logic of this in terms of the whole discussion we've just been having about the agreement and about the wider issues with Iran.
Okay. Lady back there? No? Wait for the mic. Right there.
Thanks so much. Felicia Schwartz from the Wall Street Journal. Do you think the Trump administration, this is a bit of a hypothetical, but do you think the Trump administration is so concerned about sunsets that they might be able or willing to lift sanctions more to get the Iranians to address those concerns?
Do you have any sense, I mean, when you listen to the rhetoric of the Trump administration, it's all punitive, and there's never any discussion about any further incentives to the Iranians to broaden the agreement, lengthen the agreement, and so on. Have you had, in your conversations with administration officials, any inkling that they'd be willing to have more for more, so to speak? No.
Short answer is no, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's not to rule out whatever options might open up in the future. But the short answer to the question is no. But this is a conversation which has quite a long way to run. So let's see.
Yeah. I just wrote an op-ed for Politico with Amir Hanjani, who's a senior fellow here, basically suggesting that there be new negotiations, but if the United States wants more out of Iran, it's going to have to offer American energy companies the ability to go back into Iran, for example, or to reduce the impediments to people using, to banks, European banks going into Iran, perhaps restore the dollar as a means of transactions in Iran. So to expect Iran to do more and offer nothing seems a little ridiculous. Yes, right here.
European banks don't go to Iran.
Behrouz Arabi. I actually have two questions. One is the U.S. already in violation of the UN, of this JCPOA agreement, in the sense that they promised as part of this whole deal that they will not engage in any activity that will preclude Iran from benefiting economically from JCPOA, and they don't seem to be abiding by that. So that's the first question. The second question is regarding all these other regional issues that keep being. The last time I checked, with respect to Syria, Assad's regime is still the official sovereign government sitting in the UN representing Syria. And for all these other countries to walk around and say, Assad must go, this government has to do this, we're going to take all these areas north of, think that Daesh is going to vacate, we're going to do something else with it. I mean, this is to me, a statement in complete violation of the UN Charter. The territorial integrity of Syria has to be observed. And, you know, I just don't understand how we can sit around and...
Ambassador Wittig, I'm going to throw that to you since you've been a perm rep at the UN.
Well, I don't think the U.S. Has violated this agreement. It has stuck by this agreement, and it has not violated the agreement, and we hope that it will stay that way. And on the regional issues, you mentioned Syria and that Assad has still a representative in the United Nations. That's the reality. Gérard and I, we were sitting together in the Security Council when the civil war broke out, or when a peaceful protest against the Assad regime morphed into a cruel ethnic and civil war. And we were, if I may say so, both hopeful at the time that the days of the Assad regime might be numbered. It has not turned out that way. And so we still have a bleeding Syria, and the reality is that Assad still rules it and is represented in the UN. You might deplore that, but we could not, with all our efforts, the best efforts, diplomatically and politically, change the game. That's one of the most probably tragic failures of the coalition of states who were involved in recent history, and led to the most terrible humanitarian catastrophe that we are witnessing in our times, with dramatic consequences for the neighboring region, Europe. But I just say this in a kind of deploring sense, but this is the reality we've got to deal with.
I mean, just to back up Peter on this point, yes, Assad's man may still be the Syrian representative in the UN, but this is, remember, a leader who has bombed and used chemical weapons against his own people, who has so misruled his country that there are millions of people now forced to flee the country as refugees, millions more displaced inside the country, hundreds of thousands killed by this conflict. So, you know, maybe a kind of notional legitimacy around international law, but in no way, I think, can you describe him anymore as a legitimate and acceptable leader of Syria.
That's right here.
Marisa Lino with Northrop Grumman. This is for Ambassador Araud, who was involved in the, you said at the beginning, in the negotiations. It's not perfectly clear to me that decertification means walking away from the agreement. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, and perhaps the role of our Congress. Everyone keeps saying it would be tossed to the Congress for 60 days, et cetera. What exactly does that mean?
To be frank, that's a question to the Americans. You know, I think you have to know yourself what is your legislation. You know, really, I am an outsider, you know, really, and always surprised by this country, and, you know, I love it, you know, it really, so certification, you know, according to the law, but if I read the newspapers correctly, according to the law, every 90 days, the president has to certify the Congress that actually it's a bit complicated. There are several aspects, and it's on this basis that the sanctions had been raised. If the president doesn't certify, it's sending back to the Congress to take a decision on sanctions or other decisions, and it has to do it in the 60 days, if I may, really. So it will be to the Congress. So really, so we'll be there to observe what the Congress decides or doesn't decide.
I just so happen to have a sheet of paper here that was provided to me by Ed Levine, who worked on the Hill for how long? 35 years. And he says, he reminds us that you don't need this legislation
to snap back U.S. sanctions. Congress can do it anytime it wants. It doesn't need the president to toss it. The president can decline to certify for any reason or no reason at all, apparently. He could simply say, I just don't like the deal, period. It triggers a 60-day period during which legislation would receive expedited consideration. The sanctions could be introduced only by the majority leader or the minority leader. That's interesting. Let's see. I will. And okay, if Senator McConnell, for example, were to refrain from introducing legislation, but why did it say Kevin McCarthy? Someone give you the, he's, the majority leader, okay, of the House. If Senator McConnell rejected that, then Kevin McCarthy could act, also could prevent legislation from being introduced during this 60-day period. If, however, they go forward with this, it receives expedited procedures, meaning no debate on a motion to proceed, no amendments, etc., and only 10 hours of debate in each House. So there we have it from the horse's mouth. So yeah, decertifying certainly raises a lot of questions about what would happen. But we would have to see what Mitch McConnell would do. We would have to see what Representative McCarthy would do. And not clear at all at this point what they would do with something. Congress is a little busy with some other issues, in case you hadn't noticed. Let's go to somebody way in the back. Gentleman all the way back there, right? Yes.
Thank you very much, Barbara. My question is for all the ambassadors, David, Gerard, Kim, and Peter. We had some terms in the past like rogue states, and we can have rogue people. We can talk about people who are creating danger to the world peace, and sometimes there has been talks of preemptive wars against those who are endangering the world peace. Now, my point to the ambassadors are, we have seen an agreement which has been worked on for 2 years, approved by all the major powers of the world, approved by the Security Council, and now we see one party only comes out and says, oh, I want something else, I want more than this. Don't you think it is creating a danger, a precedent to any future agreement, for any peaceful agreement, that all of a sudden somebody can come out and say, oh, I want more, I don't agree with this. So don't we should, I mean, from European countries I'm expecting, don't you think you should have a more active role rather than a passive role when you see a kind of potential for endangering the world peace? And this can be a bad precedent for any future agreement between countries. Suppose for North Korea, if they claim, oh, you make an agreement, then after 4 years somebody wants to oppose it.
Okay. Ambassador Sullivan, I don't think you've been passive.
No, I think absolutely not. I mean, we have been actively engaged in molding and shaping this agreement and bringing it to fruition. And we are, as I have said, and as my colleagues have said, we are active on the other issues. We're not naive about the other issues which are there apart from the nuclear issue, and we're very active in helping to address them. I think the key thing for me is that this administration is reviewing its Iran strategy. And I just hope that all the elements will be put into this reflection, and whatever decision is taken in the coming weeks reflects a strategy which works out how we go forward on all of these issues, how we keep Iran from not obtaining nuclear weapons through the implementation of the JCPOA, and how we can better address the other issues which we do not, the importance of which we do not deny, but which, as has been said, require perhaps more complex and issues because they're not not limited just to the issue of Iran, but to the whole context of the region. And I think that having a strategy in the context of all this is absolutely crucial, and we look forward to hearing what the administration's strategy of dealing with these issues is.
I think it's important to put this discussion on the merits of the Iran deal also in our global context, as I mentioned briefly in my introductory remarks. And I hope we can make that case in the future when we discuss this with the administration and with members of Congress. Whatever we do with Iran will have repercussions of our global order of the non-proliferation regime. And we should also not lose sight of the relationship to North Korea. What kind of message this sends to North Korea and our efforts to eventually come to a pathway towards an arrangement on the North Korean nuclear threat. We have a double-track approach there, pressure track, but also not excluding that eventually we might start a discussion process there with this country. And if we renege on that Iran deal, everything will be more complicated. And I think that is the global context and the current security threat context that we should never lose sight of.
All the way in the back there. Wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Ali Dad Mafinez. I'm with the West Asia Council. There's, of course, the JCPOA, and then there is U.S.-Iran relations. And U.S.-Iran relations have deteriorated tremendously just in the past week in the wake of President Trump's relatively or largely strident remarks at the UN General Assembly. And President Rouhani today asked for taking legal action against the U.S. For U.S. activities in the West Asia region. So the question is, what kind of role can America's European and Atlantic partners play in ensuring that this downward spiral doesn't lead to a flashpoint or some kind of altercation between the U.S. and Iran? Thank you.
Who wants to grab that one? Ambassador Araud, how about you?
No, again, what is important and what we have done, all of us, including Prime Minister May, when she met President Trump, what my president said to President Trump was to tell our American friends that we share their concerns. They have legitimate concerns about the behavior of Iran in the Middle East. And I do think that's the best way. And we had this concern before any threat of desertification, as I have said. And so we have offered to work with our American friends. We have offered to work with our American friends on that. My president met also President Rouhani, and he has expressed the same concerns to President Rouhani. He has told him very clearly that, for instance, the missile, the way the Iranians were testing intercontinental missiles didn't make any sense and could be considered as a threat. So let's have this conversation, and let's make it not a US versus Iran. Mm-hmm. Let's show that actually there is a very wide concern about it. We did the same with the Iran deal. You know, that's the Europeans which started the negotiation by the letter of the Free Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2003. During all the negotiation, we have been very keen on showing that it was not the US versus Iran, the West versus Iran. It was really a global concern. And I think that's what we should do right now.
Very good. Faye, right here. Can we get a microphone? Yeah. Okay.
I'm Faye Mokhtar, Atlantic Council member. Thank you, Barbara, for this amazing panel. My question is, if I'm sitting in Iran and my nuclear technology has been curtailed, you don't want the Iranians to develop missile technology, What happens if the Iran-Iraq war, something like that, erupts again? And if I'm sitting in Iran, I wouldn't want to be completely defenseless and not be able to defend myself. During the Iran-Iraq war, nobody helped Iran defend itself. So why would they not develop their missile technology? Why this missile issue has been always coming into the nuclear agreement talk? Thank you.
Does the EU share this preoccupation with Iran's missiles, Ambassador Sullivan?
Yes, we do. Absolutely.
And why,
yes.
if Iran says it's for deterrence?
Yeah, we have a Security Council resolution that speaks clearly about the missile tests. We think it's inconsistent with this Security Council resolution that Iran is launching those tests, those missiles, and is undertaking those tests also in recent days. That is not helpful. That has been part of the recent escalation. Let's not forget, Iran also has its domestic politics in a big way. And there are forces that want to torpedo that nuclear agreement, forces that are close to the Revolutionary Guards, the Al-Quds forces, etc. So it's not only the West who has a domestic political discussion. Iran has too, and we don't want the hostile forces in Iran to get the upper hand. And I think that's also one reason why we have to be cautious in our rhetoric.
Yes, Ed, right there. Yeah. Microphone. Pass it down. It's coming down. There you go.
Edward Levine, Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. While the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act does allow the president to decline to certify for just about any reason he might have, it's reasonable to expect that he would try to justify such an action if he were to take it. And while other countries may not have domestic groups that are concerned about Iranian compliance, there is no lack of groups in the United States that have pointed to certain Iranian actions and suggested that they are non-compliant with the JCPOA, be it on the way they handled heavy water or the number of centrifuges that they allow to spin, which seems to be more than their own proposed plan for developing new centrifuges. How do the European countries size this up? And is too little being said to address directly the concerns that some American groups have raised?
I think we are extremely vigilant. You mentioned the heavy water issue. Indeed, Iran twice surpassed this threshold of 130 tons by a little margin. The International Atomic Agency discovered that, and the Iranians corrected that. And that really testified to the functionality of the system and of the monitoring and inspection regime of the International Atomic Agency, so that the agency in 7 consecutive quarterly reports certified that Iran is in compliance.
Just to add.
Sure, go ahead, Ambassador Sullivan. Sure.
Sorry. Let's be very clear. At the meeting last week, nobody suggested that Iran was not in compliance with the agreement. There was full agreement that Iran is in compliance with the agreement and that the agreement is functioning. I think this is very, very important to be clear about this. There has been no evidence of there was the heavy water issue that Peter mentioned, but these issues have been addressed, and we have mechanisms for addressing complaints that may be there about the way in which the agreement is being implemented. But so far, the conclusion has been that so far this agreement is being respected. I think it's very, very important,
including the Americans.
It's very, very important to put that on record, that we are not dealing here with a debate about the compliance with the agreement. We are it seems, dealing with other issues around the agreement, but not with the fundamental respect of this agreement by all parties until now.
Okay, time for one more question. Who shall it be?
Sorry.
All right, no, right there next to you. Yeah. Been very patient.
Milton Honig, International Center for Tourism Studies. In follow-on negotiations after, say, 10 years, would you see the value in working toward reimposing the limitations on Iran's enrichment capacity? For instance, to, go again for the 1-year breakout time?
Gosh, that's so far ahead.
Reimposing at the end of the agreement, or?
My understanding is Iran will be a normal member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at the end of that.
And
in which case it can produce as much enriched uranium as it wants.
So would part of the negotiation be to reconsider a negotiation, to work towards some kind of negotiation which limits the
No, it's not a question of
capacity.
negotiation. It's at the expiration of the agreement, as I have said in the beginning, Iran will be NPT, full NPT member, and there will be under the monitoring with the additional protocol. The question will be still whether the nuclear program of Iran makes a civilian sense. For instance, if Iran was immediately producing high enriched uranium without any use of high enriched uranium, immediately we will be in a position to say, wow, that's a military program, and we could reimpose sanctions. Really, it's that's the way. Iran will have the full right of the civilian use of nuclear energy, but only the civilian use of nuclear energy. And it has to show whether producing highly enriched uranium has any civilian use.
And I think also, as I pointed out, if the United States or other countries wants to extend or increase the restrictions on Iran's program, it would have to offer something in return, and apparently that has not yet happened. We are out of time. Ambassadors, thank you so much. I think this has really been useful. Thank you all for coming. And in a half an hour, we will reconvene to talk about how the region thinks about Iran's nuclear program. So get a cookie or a cup of coffee, and please come back. Thank you very much.
nuclear deal. We're going to examine whether there is support, strong support for the agreement, reservations about the agreement, concerns about U.S. policy or support for U.S. policy on the part of some of the main regional players. And I'm really delighted. I have three fabulous panelists to discuss these issues. First, we're going to hear from Hussein Ibish. He's senior resident scholar at, forgive me, Iranians, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Arab Gulf States.
It's a modifier of the states, not the Gulf.
Okay, the Arab Gulf states that are across the Persian Gulf from Iran.
Well, it doesn't say that either. It's neutral on the Gulf part.
Hussein is a longtime friend. I'm sure many of you have read his commentaries. He is truly an expert on the region. He's a weekly columnist with The National, which is based in the United Arab Emirates. He previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, executive director of the Foundation for Arab American Leadership, and communications director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Then we're going to hear from another dear friend, Kadir Ustun, who is executive director of the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. This is a Turkish foundation which has been very active for the past dozen years, 10 years? How long now? 7 years, yeah. At a time when, of course, Turkey's policies have been very dynamic. Kadir also served as assistant editor of Insight Turkey, an academic journal published by SETA. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies from Columbia University and a master's degree in history from Bilkent University. And if anyone has attended the events at SETA, they know that these are really interesting and give a lot of insight into how Turkey sees the region. And then finally, we are really pleased to have Ambassador Hossein Mousavian here to talk about how Iran is viewing all of these new challenges to the JCPOA. He is Middle East Security and Nuclear Policy Specialist at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. He served as Iran's ambassador to Germany, head of the Foreign Relations Committee of Iran's National Security Council, and spokesman for Iran in its nuclear negotiations with the E3 from 2003 to 2005. He's written a number of books on U.S.-Iran relations. His latest one, Iran and the United States, An Insider's View on the Failed Past and the Road to Peace, was released in May 2014. And he's just come back from several weeks, in Iran. So I think he has a very good sense of how Iranians are viewing the debate that's going on in this country and in the region and in European capitals. So let us begin. Hussein.
Barbara.
Ahlan.
Thank you.
We have the impression, certainly have gotten the impression from some of the statements that have been coming, particularly from Saudi Arabia and from the United Arab Emirates, that they are very happy about the shift in approach of the United States. They like the Trump administration's approach to Iran. They thought that President Obama was much too soft on Iran, that he didn't understand the dynamics of the region. So I guess the question is, do these countries, and well, we can talk about the GCC as a whole, which is obviously not monolithic, especially these days. But Iran, let's just start with Saudi Arabia and UAE. Do they want the JCPOA to continue, or do they want it to be scrapped?
Okay. Let me begin by saying thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here and great to see old and new friends on this panel. Right, so you're right, first of all, that there's a pretty interesting set of diverse opinions on a range of topics within the GCC. I think the JCPOA is one of the areas, most contentious international issues in which you do find a relative consensus in the GCC that is not disrupted by the confrontation between the Quartet and Qatar. I think, in other words, there was a consensus before the standoff began, and the consensus remains now, and the consensus is still there. And it includes, I think, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as the other 4 GCC countries. So you're quite right that Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, and the others also to some extent as well, are happier with the Trump administration's approach towards Iran, with its more confrontational attitude, with its willingness to put U.S. differences with Iran, both in terms of Iran's regional policies, specific regional policies, and conduct and pattern of behavior, and the disagreements between Washington and Tehran on the long-term goals, the strategic objectives, the vision for the future of the Middle East to the forefront. They thought that those both immediate chronic issues, acute issues were being lost, and the long-term chronic issues were both getting lost during the second half of the second term of Barack Obama under a kind of a miasma of goodwill coming out of the JCPOA, and that's why they were nervous about it. However, having said that, they did all collectively agree at the 2015 Camp David summit with the Obama administration, the GCC US summit, to endorse the negotiations after being very uneasy about them, but they got sufficient reassurances at the time, and they did collectively endorse the negotiations. And then in August of 2016, at the Doha Foreign Ministers meeting, which John Kerry attended, they endorsed the JCPOA itself. Okay. And in both cases, this was sincere. And it was based on 2 understandings. First, that they had received assurances from the United States that were sufficient to assuage their acute concerns about the JCPOA, and I'll talk about those in a sec. But also that they felt that having achieved what they could, they were not going to be able to stop either the negotiations or reverse the agreement itself, and therefore they would have to sort of do what they could with the reality, rather than take, say, an Israeli attitude of actually urging that the whole thing be undone. Now, having said that, their worst fears, and it's not just that they're happier with the Trump administration, it's also that they were reassured towards the very end of the Obama administration by not only what was happening under the JCPOA, which has reassured them. In other words, it's being implemented successfully, and it has mothballed and to some extent reversed Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon, and this is a good thing from their point of view, so that, in other words, their fear that this will be ineffective is more or less assuaged. They believe it is being effective. They do not share this view of certain people in the United States that it's not effective. They think it is effective. Secondly, the bigger concern, which was that this would be the initial stage in a broader rapprochement between Washington and Tehran that would come at their expense. Right? That's very important. It's the last part. At their expense, with Iran receiving a wide range of benefits and green lights and carte blanches, or cartes blanches, I guess you would say, without having to adjust its policies, without having to adjust its regional attitude. It did not happen. And the language, the attitudes from the United States towards Iran on its regional policies and its missile testing, but especially its regional policies, started toughening before Trump took office. And you look at the last statement from a U.S. GCC joint meeting in, I think it was in November or October of 2016. See, the word terrorism reappeared, Iran's support of terrorism. That was gone for the middle part of the second Obama term in American statements jointly with the GCC towards Iran. It was back, and it was back because the United States was making no progress in going further with Iran on other issues. As the Supreme Leader kept saying, he wasn't interested in discussing them, and in fact they weren't up for negotiation. So that, in other words, the worst fears of the Gulf countries about what the JCPOA might be heralding on other fronts did not materialize. Now, in addition to that, I think it's sort of important to note that the JCPOA, while it does address concerns that Gulf states have about Iran's emergence as a nuclear power and all the impact that that could have on their other concerns, as was discussed by the ambassadors here. You know, that, in other words, the point that Ambassador Sullivan made right up front and very clearly, which is that on any problem one may have with Iran, it's going to be much more difficult to deal with a nuclear Iran than a non-nuclear Iran. This is obvious and simply true. So that's a good thing. But the big concerns, unlike the United States and perhaps Europe, and certainly unlike Israel, the Gulf states' concerns about Iran's policies were never primarily about its nuclear agenda. What they've been most concerned about is the spread of Iranian influence and hegemony inside the Arab world, not simply into areas where there are welcoming Shia majorities that have long-standing ties with Iran, like Lebanon and parts of Iraq, but beyond that, into places like Syria, which are Sunni majority, and where it is not possible to argue, as some people have, that this is all just a leveling out of the region and everything is taking its natural shape and all. That's absurd. If you look at the Iranian/Hezbollah role in Syria, you can't possibly defend that kind of argument. And that process has intensified. Iran is not only strengthening its position in various places. In Iraq, it's shakier than it was, but it's still very powerful. But things like the possibility of a permanent Iranian-controlled land bridge to Lebanon and the Mediterranean through parts of Syria, beyond the ability of even al-Assad or any regime in Damascus to approve or disapprove of, but is simply controlled by Iran and its friends, is a real possibility now, a game-changing one, a remarkable transformation. And so these kind of concerns, I think, remain uppermost in mind. So because of that, let me just answer your question very, very briefly. What they want vis-a-vis the JCPOA is for it to be rigorously enforced. That's the word that they use, and it's the word that the Trump administration was using until recently. Rigorously enforced, and I think they mean it. I think they mean hold the Iranians to their agreements and then use all other forms of leverage, including robust non-nuclear sanctions, and confronting them in all kinds of different ways with regard to maritime security, with regard to arms shipments and other forms of support from Iran and from Hezbollah to the Houthis, with regard to Iran's malignant role in Syria, and a range of other issues that we can discuss, missile development too. But,
so let me just quickly to follow up. So a
answer.
Crisis between the United States and Iran, which would be precipitated by the U.S. walking out of the JCPOA, that's not something that they would welcome? They're content with the poor state of U.S.-Iran relations as they exist now?
Well, that's not the right way to put it, but I think their concerns would not be primarily addressed in any constructive way from their point of view, as I understand it, by a walking away from a JCPOA which is being properly implemented. From their point of view, that would be a net negative, because what it would mean is that a restriction on Iran would be lost, leverage on Iran would be surrendered, and Iranian hardliners will have pocketed this reality. They will have done away with the international sanctions regime under Obama and had their their obligations under the JCPOA removed under Trump, all for nothing, all gaining the Arab states nothing at all. And in fact, removing their leverage. This, to them, I think, does not seem like a net negative. Now, just a little caveat. If you were to broaden the aperture and say, overall, do they want a more confrontational attitude towards Iran? The answer is yes. Right. But does a blow up over the JCPOA get them any closer to where they want to be? As far as I can tell, the answer is no, and they don't seem to think so. The word content is an interesting one. It was used by Albright and Company in the recent evaluation. Good paper on Saudi Arabia's potential nuclear ambitions for the Institute for Science and International Security, where they basically said they don't have any, but they might if Iran went back to an aggressive nuclear program. And they used the word content regarding Riyadh's attitude towards the JCPOA, and I think that's right.
Okay. Kadir. Turkey and Iran obviously have a very different sort of relationship. They're not always on the same page regionally, but we do remember that Turkey and Brazil tried to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran when a US effort fell apart in 2009. Lately, they seem to be on the same page when it comes to Kurdish issues. Still some disagreements, perhaps, over the fate of the Assad regime. What is the attitude in Turkey toward the JCPOA, and how are they regarding this rather significant change in tone from Washington toward the deal?
Thank you, Barbara, for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's a very important one. I would say that broadly, Turkey doesn't quite like any kind of insertion of any new layer of instability to the region. It doesn't work for Turkey when you have militarization of crises, conflicts, because that's not where Turkey feels most strong about. That's just a broad point. But uncertainty and instability seems to be the sort of ongoing theme in the region. And once you feel like ISIS appears to be set back, you have the KRG's referendum for independence. You have, while Syrian conflict seems to be winding down, you have the PYD's efforts to create an autonomous area, which is a problem for Turkey. Similarly, Gulf crisis again pops almost out of nowhere. So these kind of elements of uncertainty and instability is a problem. So if the Trump administration is definitely looking to confront Iran regionally, as Mr. Ibish talked about, I think Turkey shares some of those concerns, regional concerns about Iran's activities.
But they're on the same side regarding Qatar.
No, exactly. For a variety of different reasons, but is the Trump administration going to confront Iran regionally with or without the agreement, right? That seems to be the question. So if they abandon the agreement without a clear policy, that's going to create new problems for the regional powers. Under this kind of pressure and threats by the administration, Iran seems to be kind of reaching out to Turkey in particular, but others as well in the region. But this won't be easy because of Syria. What happened in Syria was Turkey and Iran found themselves at opposite ends of a conflict. But as I said, Turkey is concerned to the extent that it's called it Iranian expansionism. So it is a serious problem for Turkey, but the nuclear deal itself does not, whether that is cancelled, is a concern to see how that broader policy is going to develop. As you remember, in 2010, Turkey, as you mentioned actually, Turkey was involved as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council to try to find a middle ground between the West and Iran, and even there was this Tehran declaration, which ended up hurting Turkey's relationship with the US in particular, because the US wasn't happy about that deal. I won't go into details, but we had a whole debate for about 6 to 9 months, something like that, about Turkey turning east, leaving the West, etc. That ended sharply with Turkey's stationing of the NATO radars in radar in Malatya in the eastern part of Turkey. That showed actually Turkey was just as concerned about Iranian capabilities, missiles and others like the West, but it was trying to find a diplomatic solution, and it argued at that point the sanctions would lead to military action and which would lead to war. Again, that element of instability was not in Turkey's favor. With the Arab Spring, I'm just skipping very fast to Syria. When Syrian uprising turned into a conflict and eventually a regional proxy war, Turkey and Iran found themselves at opposite ends. And there, again, there was an element of uncertainty in the sense that we didn't know what the US wanted to do exactly. And US policy was reduced to counterterrorism over time. I'm not criticizing it, I'm just observing it. So that Turkey kept seeking leadership from Washington, which never came, and then you find now Turkey negotiating, trying to negotiate, find a common ground with Russia and Iran through the Astana process. So on the ground, they're quite supporting the opposite groups, and they have very different aims in Syria, but at the same time, they're keeping this diplomatic track alive, both for Turkey to protect its relatively narrow interests in northern Syria, but also to find a solution and end the conflict in Syria. One more example to this, Gulf crisis, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was a serious disconnect between the president and the national security team that was just too obvious. And these mixed signals were worrisome for regional powers in general, but Turkey as well. And Turkey had very strong relationship with Qatar, but it also had strong relations with Saudis. So it tried to again find a middle ground and tried to negotiate. You know, that initial list included a Turkish base to be removed from Qatar. So what you found Turkey doing, they also met the Iranians, right? They tried to negotiate. So Turkey, you find once again trying to eliminate that element of uncertainty to calm down the crisis, and at the same time, again, you have mixed signals at best, or no clear policy from Washington on this. Last thing, today this KRG referendum is being held, and there is, Iran is strongly opposed to it, Turkey is opposed to it, the US officially is opposed to it. Many in the region doubt that. They think that they're playing some sort of game, but I'm just stating that, I'm not arguing for it. It is causing quite a lot of anxiety in the region for different reasons for Iran and for different reasons for Turkey. There seems to be a bit of a room for sort of working together against this referendum, but again, Turkey's relationship with KRG is very different than Iran's relationship with KRG. If the nuclear deal is canceled by this administration, or they don't certify it, are we going to go back to sanctions and war, sort of a US-Iran standoff, where you have sanctions and war versus diplomacy option, which we spent several years, many years actually, under the Obama administration, that ended up producing this agreement, which is not perfect, obviously, but what is going to replace it, right? That's a worry, and if it's going to lead to a sharper confrontation between the US and Iran, and confronting Iran will mean actual fighting on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, Yemen, elsewhere, things are going to be unstable. So going back to my initial remark, Turkey won't be happy about that instability. We'll try to calm down the situation, but that doesn't mean Turkey doesn't think that Iran needs to be contained or confronted regionally. So I would say that the Turkish policy towards the nuclear deal, which is not the top of the agenda, to be honest, at this point, between PYD and KRG in northern Iraq and northern Syria, but it does have a bearing on what the US wants to do in the Middle East, and in particular in terms of its Iran policy. So
yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, President Erdogan met again with
Trump, I believe, yeah?
Yes.
This past week. Does he raise the JCPOA at all, or is he too busy talking about Kurdish issues, Syria? I mean, with the Europeans, it's always very, very high on the list of issues that they raise with Trump.
To be honest, I don't know what they talked about specifically, but from reports, from what we know from others, advisors, the priority is the U.S. support for PYD, the armed support for the PYD, and opposition to KRG. Those are really the top agenda items.
Yeah, thought it was interesting this morning that apparently half of the 50-minute conversation that Theresa May had with President Trump was about Iran, which seems rather a lot. Hussein, welcome.
Thank you.
You've just come back from Iran recently. I remember when the election was going on, there were actually some Iranian friends of mine who said, "Oh, Trump will be much better than Hillary," and we really, Hillary will be much tougher on us than he will be. How are people reacting there? How concerned are they whether this agreement is going to last? How confident are they that the Europeans, regional partners, and so on will maintain support for the agreement if Trump does not?
Thank you, Barbara. First of all, let me go back to the main issue of the panel, which is JCPOA, Iran, and the region. Iran has 15 neighboring countries. 8 of them are non-Arabs and 7 Arabs. All non-Arab countries, they have been supporting of peaceful management of nuclear crisis, and they are supporting nuclear deal. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, all of them, to Turkey. We have 7 Arab countries. Iraq is not member of GCC.
Right.
Iraq has been supportive of nuclear deal and peaceful diplomacy with Iran. Then we have 6 GCC countries. Out of the 6, Oman always has been against Saudi Arabia diplomacy on Iran. They did a crucial role on Iran-US negotiations. They played very constructive role. Qatar, Kuwait, always they try to stay somehow in between. The most hostile have been Saudi Arabia and Emirates. We don't have actually independent country like Bahrain, because Bahrain means Saudi Arabia. Therefore, I would say just 2 countries. Emirates is playing double game with Saudi Arabia and Iran. On political and security issues is ally of Saudi Arabia and making the most business with Iran. Practically, Emirates is partner number 1. The official trade figures always is between top 5. Unofficially, because they smuggling billions of dollars of goods to Iran, they are number 1. Therefore, nobody knows what they are doing. This is 1. Therefore, Barbara, it's important to understand out of 15 neighboring countries, we have 2 hostile countries against JCPOA and other issues. It is not all about the region. Yeah. Because everybody here is talking about the region, they think it is only Saudi Arabia or Emirates. No, it is not the case. Second, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, constant policy before the deal and after the deal remains the same. First, always they have been looking after the nuclear crisis, 2003, they have been looking military strike against Iran. You have hundreds of WikiLeaks before the deal. Saudis, Emiratis, they have been pushing the US to attack Iran. And even during President Obama, John Kerry just stated twice that even with Obama was looking engagement with Iran, still they were pushing Kerry, Obama to attack Iran. Therefore, this has been the first strategy they have been looking for before the deal and after the deal. Second, the maximum possible sanctions, short of war. it really has remained the same, no changes. Before JCPOA, after JCPOA. Third, zero role for Iran in the region. It has not changed, the same. Before JCPOA, after JCPOA. And fourth, zero engagement between Iran and the US. They are extremely afraid a day Iran and the US, they go to bed. That's why they hate Obama and they love Trump. Because Obama was for engagement and Arabs, I mean, when I say Arabs, only I'm talking about these two countries. They were very much afraid that Obama would go beyond nuclear deal. And fifth is zero defense capability for Iran, because they want, whenever the situation is ready, to invade Iran like they did early revolution. Shah left, they thought this is the best time, an Arab country invaded, and GCC, only Saudi Arabia, paid $97 billion to Saddam to invade Iran, to dismantle Iran. Therefore, I would say with these 5 sustainable strategies, before JCPOA and after JCPOA, I really don't see any changes practically. I believe they have a very clear strategy, and of course you cannot expect Iran to embrace such a nice neighbors with such a policies. The part 2, Barbara, is about what the EU ambassadors, they said. The key issue of Trump administration is about Iranian regional behavior. Am I right?
Right.
And the EU ambassadors, they say they have a joint understanding with the US, not about JCPOA, but about the Iranian regional behavior. And the key issue always Israelis, Saudis, they are raising is about Iranian influence, right? But it's extremely important to understand how Iranians view the role of the US, the West, and GCC on regional stabilities. First of all, they say it was an Arab country invading Iran, killing, injuring hundreds of thousands of Iranians. Second, it was United States of America who attacked Iraq. The root causes of all crisis in Iraq is the US attack. It was not Iranian attack. Third, it was the US attacked Afghanistan. And today 50% of Afghanistan is in the hand of Taliban. After 10, 13 years
16 years.
16 years. And terrorism has been expanded initially because of these 2 American military strikes in the region. Who invaded Libya? Does Iran has any influence in Libya? It was the US, Europe, NATO, and GCC. And what is the situation of Libya? It was another war. Who is attacking Yemen? Saudi Arabia, the US. Therefore, you can see the wars, whether this is Afghanistan or Yemen or Iraq or Libya or against Iran, all has been created by the US and its regional allies. This is exactly what Iranians are concerned about, the regional behavior of the US, the West, and GCC. You need to understand what is the reality. Who created the wars? It was Iran? Iranians, they have saved 2 Arab states from total collapse, Syria and Iraq. Without Iranian help, Iraq would have collapsed in the hand of ISIS. And Syria would have collapsed in the hand of ISIS. Who supported the terrorists to bring a regime change in these 2 countries? Who attacked the Arab countries? It was Iran. Therefore, you can see how the views are very, very different. It would be really good to have a realistic dialogue between the regional powers and international powers to discuss the source of problems in order to find the solution to problems. The US, you read, Barbara, thousands of articles. They say Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism, Saudi money is GCC money is the source of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. You hear President Trump before election saying Saudi Arabia is the source of number one source of terrorism. Obama created ISIS. After election says Saudi Arabia is my main strategic partner. You know, we really don't understand what's going on in this country with the president in just some month. Some month ago says Saudi Arabia is source number one of terrorism. After he is elected says Saudi Arabia is my partner number one. Therefore Iran, believe me, everyone you talk in Tehran, they believe the US, Saudi Arabia, they are all behind the terrorist groups. And the US does not want ISIS to die. And you can find a lot of documents in the US side also. You heard Hillary hearing at Congress saying that the US had a role funding ISIS, funding Al-Qaeda and Taliban, you remember? And everybody knows about September 11, 15 of 2019, they were Saudis. You have not seen one single Iranian to be involved in any terrorist activities in Europe and the US, but the terrorist country number one is Iran. Therefore, this is something very important. There is no difference, believe me, in Iran on the regional issues. Iranians, whether moderates, reformists, or conservatives, they view the US, Saudi Arabia, Arabs with the same what I explained for you. There is no difference. On Trump, you are right. There were some Iranians, they liked Trump versus Hillary because they believed if Trump is elected, it would undermine the US, and this would be in the interest of Iran. I think the Trump is doing the same. Do you need anything more?
No, I think that kind of covers it. I'm going to come back to you, Hussein, because I think you should react to some of the things that the other Hussein said.
No, I would love to.
No, I mean, my understanding of the way Saudis, Emiratis feel, certainly about Iran's regional activities, is that these are Arab countries and Iran should keep its hands out of them. Well, that's basically, Iran should have nothing to do. Okay, maybe they grant
Do you mean
Iraq
because they are Arab countries, Saudi Arabia has right to attack Yemen? Has right to attack every country, has right to invade.
Obviously, the Saudis did not attack Yemen.
They are neighbor of Iran. Iran has right on the neighboring country.
I'm asking Hussein, so I won't get into a debate with you. I'll let Hussein.
No, I mean, okay. So let me just say, I think what we got from my good friend Said Hussein was an excellent explanation in the second half of his remarks about how Iranians in general see the world, the Middle East, their neighbors. I think that was an accurate summary of Iranian attitudes, and I think it was very useful in that regard. Although I'm skeptical that there's no diversity of opinion in Iran on this. That would amaze me, but I'll take him at his word. There's no big diversity of opinion. I'm skeptical, but okay. Let's stipulate that there's no big diversity of opinion on that. The first part of his remarks, which was a summary of GCC, or Saudi and Emirati policies towards Iran, unless we were to ascribe it as a consensus Iranian interpretation of those policies, in which case it might be accurate. But if it were to be taken as an actual summary of the policies of those countries, it was a caricature. Particularly on, for example, zero Iranian role in the region. That is not the Saudi and Emirati policy towards Iran. Zero Iranian defense capabilities. That is not their expectation, nor their ambition. What they are afraid of is, and with I think reason, is the emergence of Iran as a regional hegemon with a set of alliances that give it a disproportionate weight in the region and which take its influence very far afield from any area in which it could legitimately claim to have either majority indigenous support or a compelling immediate national security interest. For example, far-off parts of Syria. Right? In the list of wars that you mentioned, I think you gave a pretty accurate summation of kind of the way many Iranians would view it. But I think it would be very hard to talk about, kind of a list of grievances about who has done what in the region, and not include Iran's role in Syria in the past few years as an extremely problematic one, legally, morally, politically, etc. I mean, otherwise one is simply blind to the legal, moral, and political realities. In Yemen, I think we can all agree that war would be best resolved as soon as possible, and that it has not gone well for the coalition. However, it was pursuant to a UN Security Council resolution, and the relative merits of the Houthis versus the Hadi legitimate government is not really open to question. If you go back to the Security Council resolution, it's important. So the legitimacy of the goal of the intervention is hard to question. The way in which it's been pursued is very easy to question and really ought to be questioned. Those are two different points. So really just my response is very useful from the point of view of explaining Iranian worldview and Iranian consensus, not so helpful as an actually accurate summary of the policies towards Iran of Saudi Arabia and the UAE at all.
Thank you.
Two different things.
Turkey is somewhat in the middle here in terms of its interpretation of Iranian activities. I've heard Iranian diplomats say that Iran is a status quo power. But I've also heard Iranian diplomats say that they understand that they have an ideological role to play in terms of supporting groups that are oppressed, fellow Shia, and so on. How does Turkey see it? And I mean, we pointed out there's some confluence of interest now on Qatar, on the Kurdish issue, but in general, as a former imperial power itself, how does Turkey see what Iran is doing in the region?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a diversity of opinion, let's say, in Turkey, but broadly, they are concerned about what some call Iranian expansionism, which what it means is pro-Iranian militias, groups in Syria, specifically within the PKK, there is an Iranian sort of pro-Iranian branch that for many analysts in Turkey that was particularly influential in the breakdown of the peace process, and in Iraq, they don't think that Iran has been helpful in making sure that Sunnis were part of the political system, which with the breakdown of the sort of Iraqi polity as a whole, they don't think Iran played a very constructive role in that. These are some of the complaints and that would go against the ambassador's description of the Iranian view. But as I was saying initially in my remarks, Turkey has always both competed with Iran and challenged them at times, but at the same time found ways to work together because they recognize they're there to stay. They do have a confluence of interests on a variety of issues. So, and of course, a U.S.-Iran war, potential one, would be extreme, or a war between GCC and Iran in the Gulf would be highly destabilizing, and it would be against the interests of the region, including Turkey. So I don't think they think of Iran as innocent as that was described, but of course they see it as a legitimate regional power. They did actually, in the Iranian nuclear deal, they did argue for Iran's right for enrichment. They thought that this was given by NPT and it needed to be protected as a principle. Some probably thought that in the future Turkey would have to also develop similar capabilities. So I would say it's a bit more sort of, let's say, sophisticated than saying Iran is all bad and Iran is all good.
Yeah, that's it.
Barbara, on the fear of regional or the US or Western countries on the rise of Iranian influence. Of course, one part of Iranian influence is because of the natural situation of Iran, geographical situation, 80 million human resources, very strong leadership. Also, I believe part of it is because Iranians, they are very much well trained how to resist the US, how to resist the sanctions. That's why Iran perhaps is the only country in the region which is independent on security, is not neither dependent to the US or Russia. Iran is totally independent on its security. But the big issue which nobody pays attention is the other part why Iran influence is increasing. I believe this is because of failures in the Arab countries. Dysfunctionality of Arab regimes, corruptions, dictatorship for decades. It is really the reason the Arab world, if I do not say Arab world, Arab League has collapsed practically. We don't have a united GCC today. You can see the crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. You can see how disputed we do not have neither a GCC as a united organization nor Arab League. They all have collapsed. The dysfunctionality, the corruption, undemocratic structure of these countries, dictatorship for decades is at least one of the main reasons of the collapse of Arab world. And they do not like to mention these realities about themselves. They try to blame Iran because of the problems in their own countries.
There is, of course, a difference of opinion about whether the relationship between the crisis of the Arab state, which is very real, and the growth of Iranian influence in the region is, which is the causality? In other words, is Iran is simply saving?
Arab Spring started because of what?
No, of course not. But the question, in other words, is in a country, is Iran exacerbating the problem through its support of a whole myriad of non- and sub-state actors, militias, etc., in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, perhaps in Bahrain, as some people argue, including the United States and elsewhere? Or is it saving, as an Iranian might say, is it saving Syria, by supporting Mr. Assad? Is he the savior of Syria?
I think the truth is somewhere in between.
Is it? And so that's the question. Is it, in other words, what's the relationship between that policy of supporting non-state actors and the relative functionality of these states? That's a very interesting question.
I should point out that many countries in the region, and of course the United States, has supported freedom fighters in a variety of conflicts around the world. And one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, as we know. Let me open this up now so we don't just have a debate between the two Husseins. Faye, we'll start with you. Wait for the microphone to come down.
Is it? Oh, yeah, it's on. Thank you. This question is for Ambassador Mousavian. First of all, welcome back to Atlantic Council. My question to you is, what positive steps have Iranians taken toward the Saudis to reduce the tension that has been going on for a long time? As you know, the Saudis are spending millions of dollars in Washington to pretty much hold the foreign policy of Trump. So what are the steps that Iranians have taken to be able to talk to the Saudis and resolve these conflicts? Thank you.
There has been official approach. The foreign minister of Kuwait came to Tehran, raised the concern of GCC with the Iranian president and his counterpart, and Iran responded very positively. And Rouhani visited Kuwait, Oman, and discussed the main issues the GCC, they are concerned about Iran. Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, they were really ready to go for a broad dialogue between Iran and GCC, but Saudi Arabia stood against. The foreign minister of Kuwait came to Tehran with the mandate of GCC. GCC already, they agreed what issues are the main point of concerns. But they did not expect Iranian constructive or positive reaction. When Iran reacted positively, then Saudi Arabia backed off. This is on official side. Unofficially, there has been, since 2013, many second tracks between Iran, GCC, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and countries, Europeans, Japan, even Obama, Kerry, they tried a lot. And they all know very well, this is not my claim. If you ask Japanese, Europeans, even Obama administration, Americans, Trump doesn't want, but Obama really wanted. They all know Iran was very ready, constructive, participated at high level, seriously, but all was blocked because of Saudi Arabia. Saudis, they feel they have lost the game in the region, and they want the US to put all pressures in order to weaken Iran to reach to a point of balance. You know, they are waiting to see when the US pressures on Iran would weaken Iran to put them in a balanced situation in order to negotiate with Iran. I don't believe it's going to happen. You can see since 2011, the Saudi position in the region is weakened, and they are losing more and more, and Iranians are gaining more and more. If they want to continue, that's the game. But however, officially and unofficially, I know Foreign Minister Zarif has been ready to have the same platform of P5+1 and Iran on the nuclear. He has been ready and is ready to have the same platform with Iran and GCC, 6+1. And some GCC countries, they really love it, but Saudi Arabia is not ready.
Can I say that specific exchange involving Kuwait underlies, from the point of view of the Gulf countries, and not just Saudi Arabia, not all of them, but not just Saudi Arabia, it emphasized one of the biggest problems in dialogue between Iran and the Gulf Arab states, which is essential. I mean, I must say, it ought to be everybody's goal to get everybody around the table and start talking, right? That should be the end goal. But one of the biggest problems is that the Arab side in this does not feel they speak to a unified Iranian interlocutor, that Iran has one set of policies over here and another set of policies over there, that this wing of the government has this attitude and another wing of the government has another attitude. And as they talk to the president and the foreign minister, they are talking to one Iran. And if they're dealing with the IRGC and the Quds Brigade, they're talking to another Iran, and that's really a problem. When the Kuwaitis were actually discussing face-to-face with President Rouhani, they got one set of responses to the conditions that the GCC laid down as necessary conditions. When they received the written response, which they thought looked like it was written by a committee of people who did not really see eye to eye, they got a different response on some of those specific points. Things like that the Iranian Revolution was a unique event and could not be, in any way, the word was not exported, but did not have relevance outside of Iran. They had very different answers in those two moments. And that reaffirmed to them that really big concern, that they don't deal with a unified entity that is absolutely. So that is a big problem for them. Other than that, though, I think there's a lot a lot of what Hussein said about the concerns that the Gulf states have about the relative imbalance in this dialogue is right. And he's not wrong about who's willing to just sort of jump into talks right now and who isn't. Yes, you're right about that. That is true.
Can I just add that I understand that there will be an exchange of delegations just to look at embassy properties, consulates. Of course, we remember that the Saudi embassy was trashed after the execution of Sheikh Nimr. And so apparently the Saudis have agreed to send a delegation to go and examine the property and see what has to be done. And Iran will come and look at its embassy in Riyadh and its consulate in Jeddah.
This is not out of the question. We have seen some positive signs recently. I mean, so
and the Hajj, of course, Iranians went to the Hajj.
It's very important. And if you ask the Saudis and others, is this about relations with Iran or just the Hajj? They'll say it's just the Hajj. It can't be just the Hajj. There is no just the Hajj. Since the founding of the second Saudi state in the 20s, Iran-Saudi relations, when they come to a head, the Hajj is always a major issue. It's not even since the Islamic Republic, since the founding of the second Saudi state. So this is about relations, and it's a good thing.
Kadir, can I ask about the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, I guess it is, meets in Istanbul? Did it meet in Istanbul recently? Does it play any role in this, or is this really strictly between the Saudis and the Iranians to work out?
Well, I'm not sure if it ended, but the current, I believe, the term is in Turkey, and Erdogan during the Gulf crisis spoke with that voice also. In addition, when he talked about sort of Saudis being the big brothers and trying to find a solution. But these international organizations broadly, including the UN, I feel like they're not as effective as they used to be with the sort of trend going downwards for internationalism and more sort of nationalist policies. I mean, Trump advised that to other nations at the UN as well, and we didn't, Russia wasn't there, Germany wasn't there, who else wasn't there? But 3 out of P5+1 were not at the UN. I think that's an important trend to also consider. When a couple of things reminded me of that. When we talk about part of the delegation exchange of delegations and trying to find a common ground is because the U.S. does not have a sort of policy that, okay, here's my Iran policy and everybody align, or here's my Iraq policy. Some consider that as a good thing because it's forcing the regional powers to come together and try to find a solution between themselves. But then you see US coming back and saying, hold on a second, here are my interests. And we were discussing this with the US withdrawal from Iraq with a friend of mine in DC, when he said, we really want to get out, we don't want to be there, etc. And I said, that's not going to be true. Soon enough you'll be saying, here's my interest, I'm coming back. And that happened in June 2014 with ISIS taking over Mosul. All of a sudden US said, no, this is unacceptable, we have a policy now but on ISIS, which then pushes all regional actors to have to adjust to it, right? So some things that they may have worked out between themselves could be actually destroyed, or it could lead to new openings. But this is going to be a factor going forward, how the US formulates its regional policy and then specific Syria, Iraq, Iran policies. The regional powers, none of them is strong enough to quote-unquote dictate. Right. Of course, many would argue US is not strong enough to dictate it either, but it's much stronger than anybody else to dictate its terms. So this element, if the US coming to the region with mixed signals and sort of confused policies, we're going to have more problems, not less.
Yes, sure.
Yes, Behrouz Halavi. My question is, it relates to a term that I keep hearing, and that's Iranian hegemony. So what does that mean? I mean, I remember a long time ago, Chinese used to complain about Russian hegemony, or Vietnamese about Chinese hegemony. But in the context of the region, what does it mean?
Hegemony, roughly speaking, means an influence well beyond the normal diplomatic and trade leverage that countries would have. In other words, the ability to essentially, if not dictate to another government, at least very strongly influence its internal policy, so in particular its defense and foreign policy. So to take an example, right now the Iranian role in Syria is hegemonic, and hegemonic because the Syrian regime is no longer independent of Iran's influence. It is so dependent on Iranian organized fighters, whether they be IRGC fighters, Hezbollah fighters, Afghans brought in very large numbers from Afghanistan by Iran to fight in Syria. The Syrian regime would have fallen probably, or come very close to falling in 2016 if a joint surge, military surge by Iranian-backed forces, that is Iranian forces, Hezbollah, Afghan and Iraqi forces, all under the broad leadership of Iran and Iranian-backed groups in Syria, in conjunction with Russian forces in the air and the intelligence level and other diplomatics, had not intervened to save this blood-soaked, blood-drowned dictatorship in Damascus. Perhaps the most evil regime in the world. By the way, as far as the UN goes, the Khmer Rouge represented Cambodia at the UN during the entire genocide. So who sits at the UN is not really a great litmus test of moral legitimacy when it comes to this amount of blood and guts. But that's what hegemony means. It's a good example. And particularly given the context of what al-Assad rule has meant for Syria and what cost it has imposed, it puts this into perspective. In addition to which, the reasons why this is so important have to do with securing a similar relationship that Iran has with much of Lebanon, that is controlled by Hezbollah, which has a very direct relationship with the IRGC, and with creating a direct, as I said, land bridge, not only between Iran and Lebanon, that is Hezbollah, through Syria, but also to the Mediterranean. And as I say, and this is crucial, independent of the wishes of the regime in Damascus. And that is a goal that is close to realization. All of that can be described as not only hegemonic, but regionally imperial and extraterritorial. It's pretty extraordinary. And I'm not sure hegemony quite cuts it as a word, actually.
Hussein, you want to reply?
Barbara, I believe Syria is not really a good case to discuss hegemony.
I'm sure not.
Because everyone knows in this room who recruited which countries. Tens of thousands of terrorists from all over the world bringing to Syria. And Iranians, they have been supporting Assad, its army, even militia, to fight these tens of thousands of terrorists. They were not Syrians, from the US, Europe, Chechnya, all over the world. Therefore, this is a fight between these two groups, and everyone knows who funded, who gave weapons, from which borders they came, these tens of thousands. Some figures, it says 110,000. But look at Saudi behavior over Bahrain. Is a very good example of hegemony. Has totally in hand, full influence. Look at Saudi behavior toward Qatar. It was totally hegemony against a neighboring country. It was Qataris, always they are saying that Saudi Arabia does not respect our integrity, sovereignty, interference, wants us as a puppet. This is a very good example if you want to know what do they mean about hegemony.
Well, I wouldn't dispute.
Okay. Let's take some more questions. The gentleman over here. Say your name and ask a question.
It's actually a good definition. Of
Steve Winters, consultant. I'd like to address this to the ambassador, and I see this as a very sympathetic question, but I'd like to hear your view on it. From President Rouhani's speech at the United Nations, it seemed that he was emphasizing the fact that he had been elected the leader of the country to represent a moderate position, and therefore that indicated that a majority of the people who voted were supporting such moderate behavior as he outlined. At the same time, it would seem also true that there are various elements in the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force, of course, the previous president, Ahmadinejad, going back, who see themselves as somehow guarantors of the purity of the revolution, and really have a slightly different concept. And of course, this feeds in with the points being made that perhaps they've been the most active in some overseas things. So given that there actually is this tension, even at the highest levels of the society, how do you see this as playing out in the future? Do you see these groups as converging, or do you see it's like a struggle? Are the moderates going to prevail and the others not?
I fully agree that Iran is a very diversified society. It's very different with Saudi Arabia or other GCCs. We have a real parliament. No one can dissolve. Even the leader cannot dissolve the parliament. The parliamentarians, they were opposing even Ahmadinejad, and in many cases Dr. Rouhani. Therefore, they are completely independent. The judiciary is not in the hand of government. However, we have reformists, we have moderates, we have conservatives, in many ways like what you have here, you know. Even you have here a Congress challenge the government. Nobody, I mean, Europeans even, they didn't know who is talking on the behalf of who in Washington, who is deciding. And JCPOA is a good example. And today, even nobody knows who is going to decide on what. But the Iranian constitution has a very powerful structure for decision making. I really do not believe what my friend Hossein said about the decision-making system in Iran. We have National Security Council. The Speaker of Parliament is there. President is there. The head of judiciary is there. Intelligence minister is there. Army is there. They are all there. When they decide, of course, the leader would confirm. Then this is a national decision. Nuclear deal is excellent example. The nuclear deal was more disputed in Iran than the US. Everyone who knows Iranian domestic situation, they can understand. They blamed the foreign minister as betrayer, a spy of the US, puppet of the US. In the parliament, you know, it was disaster, the fighting. But at the end, when the National Security Council decided and the leader confirmed, up to now, you cannot see any failure from the Iranian side on this decision. But you can see a lot of failure on the US side. Therefore, the question is more about the US. Forget the region because their system is one man, finish. But even about the US, we have more problem.
Young man right here.
I'll keep the U.S. Constitution.
Okay. Vince Alfaso, Eurasia Review. Hossein, congratulations on your LA Times article 11 days ago. Great read, interesting read. Considering that the JCPOA came in without a single fired shot, an angry Donald Trump tweet is pretty remarkable. My question is, from the Washington perspective, do they see this deal more from a geopolitical sense of Iran's so-called behavior rather than this actually being a nuclear issue.
Who's they?
Is this directed to me or?
Directed to anybody.
Yeah, sure, Barbara, you should respond.
And just briefly, what kind of advice would you give to policymakers in Washington who are going through these negotiations towards the October 15th deadline?
I don't think anybody understands Donald Trump's views on a lot of issues. I mean, he prides himself on being a great negotiator. He claims the JCPOA was not well negotiated and that he somehow could have done better. I think anybody who followed the negotiations closely realized that there were a lot of compromises that had to be made on all sides in order to get a deal. I remember a discussion over, for example, the duration of some of the restrictions on Iran's uranium enrichment. Iran wanted 0 restrictions, US wanted 20 years, they settled around in the middle. This is the way negotiations go. Trump wants to put his own stamp on Iran policy. Iran policy has been officially under review now for how many months has it been since Trump came in? We're all
7 months.
Right. I had heard that the review had been completed, that the interagency process resulted in a recommendation to continue to certify the JCPOA while working on strengthening other means of dealing with Iran's regional activities. I heard that 2 weeks ago, but the administration has not yet announced its decision. And President Trump certainly in his comments at the UN made it sound as though he was not going to take the advice of his national security establishment. Unlike the Iranian system, which does tend to reach a consensus decision, it seems that he is not going to accept that. So we are all waiting to see, It is one thing to say that Iran policy will not be hostage to the JCPOA. This has been the critique that he has made. But to create a new Iran policy without a JCPOA seems to me very unlikely to succeed, and instead we will have yet another crisis with Iran and no way of really containing Iran's nuclear program as we currently do now. So my advice has been quite obvious, which is keep the JCPOA. And if you want to talk to Iran about other issues, talk to Iran about other issues. We have channels now, thanks to the JCPOA, to do that. But the State Department hasn't shown much interest. The NSC hasn't shown much interest. And if you were here for the earlier discussion, I asked the European ambassadors whether the Trump administration had offered to put anything new on the table in return for Iranian concessions on some of these other issues, and they said no. In my view, I think anybody who's ever negotiated anything, you have to offer something if you want something in return. So we're all still waiting. We will see what the policy is when it is unveiled.
My advice is listen to your friends.
Listen to your friends. Well, but your friends may be telling you different things.
Your allies.
If the U.S. listens, if the U.S. listens to its closest allies in Europe, it'll keep the deal.
I didn't say Europe. I said listen to your closest allies. Across the board. I think you're going to get a pretty similar answer.
Closest allies are in Europe.
You're going to get a similar answer anyway.
Japan, South Korea.
These are allies. There's one big dissenting voice in Israel.
Well, and even in terms of Israel, and we should have had someone here representing the Israeli point of view. There isn't an Israeli point of view. There's Bibi Netanyahu, and then and there's the Israeli national security establishment, which tends to be in favor of the
right. You're absolutely
JCPOA. So a lot of this is politics. A lot of this is optics. I would like Trump to be able to declare victory and say that he has achieved a tougher U.S. policy toward Iran, that he stiffened the spine of the Europeans. And declare victory. That would be my advice to him.
Well, even achieving that would be even better than just saying it.
Gentleman right there.
Joel Scheckman from Reuters. So let's say like October 15th comes, Trump doesn't recertify the JCPOA. Secondary sanctions go back in place, and I'm abbreviating this process a little bit. Let's say
it's not. That's not automatic that these sanctions come back. It's just there's a chance they could.
Right. Let's say it doesn't get recertified October 15th, and they talk about reimposing secondary sanctions. Like, how is that likely to play out? How's that actually likely to play out, like in Europe and with U.S. partners? What would actually be like the state of play for that?
Maybe you weren't here for the earlier panel with the European ambassadors. I would encourage you to listen to the tape of that, the webcast of that. But let me ask in terms of the region. Kadir, would Turkey stop trading with Iran if the U.S. Congress reimposed secondary sanctions?
Well, sanctions created a lot of problems for Turkey. Turkey tried to distinguish between UN sanctions and US sanctions and said that it didn't recognize the US sanctions. And Obama administration gave several waivers for Turkey because there were already, Turkey was buying oil and gas from Iran with pre-existing sort of agreements. That sort of, then there was the solutions like gold trade and stuff like that.
Which got some people into trouble.
But I think if the US goes for a whole new round of sanctions, I think Turkey will look at the situation and see what it can implement, what it cannot, because I think, look, there's no real trust between Turkey and Iran. And that's true for U.S. And Iran as well. And I don't think the JCPOA is perfect, and I don't think Obama's policy to make it the central piece of his Iran policy was not well received. I mean, I think he saw it as an opening for the future, and he thought that the next administration would move on to a broadening of relations with Iran. But I think the main thing here, whether Trump administration cancels it or not, doesn't cancel it, and then goes for sanctions, again, we're going to come back to the same question we asked during Obama's administration. What are you trying to accomplish here? I mean, some authors, criticized at the time Obama's policy as being too focused on sanctions, not leaving room for diplomacy, which came much later. So if we're going to go back to an unproductive dynamic, right, without a clear goal, the U.S. goal in terms of what it's trying to achieve, I think you would find a partner in Turkey if you wanted to confront Iran in a certain way, in a limited way in Syria and in Iraq, where it comes closest to, I think, being called a hegemon, but I really don't like that word because I think it's loaded and it's difficult to describe. But anyway, if Turkey has been complaining about Iran's role in the region, its activities in Syria, elsewhere. So sanctions, no sanctions is a very limited, narrow discussion, and it needs to be broadened. It needs to be the U.S. If it's, I know the Secretary of Defense Tillerson and others in the national security team, they do understand Iran well, I think. But what kind of policy they want to implement, what does it mean to confront Iran, those remain unclear, with or without the nuclear deal. And is that going to move the region to another, a whole new standoff? We're going to see warships in the Gulf, war of attrition inside Syria and in Iraq. Like, how it's going to play out is important. We do talk about confronting Iran, and many regional actors, Gulf, Turkey, could potentially be part of that, but it's not clear what the U.S. is going to do about that. So.
My old friend John Limbert from the State Department used to say that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. This gentleman right here.
Hello, thank you all. My question is for the ambassador.
Can we say your name?
Yeah, my name is Sharath Patel. I'm with the European Union delegation. This past week, Senator McCain issued a statement praising the release of Mavash Sabet, one of the leaders of the Baha'i faith in Iran who was imprisoned for the past decade. I was curious if you have any thoughts on the future of rights of Baha'is over the coming years, especially in light of the shifting dynamics in the region.
The Iranian judiciary frequently has addressed this issue. Even last week, the Speaker of Judiciary said Iran has no problem with the minorities' rights on Baha'is in Iran. If there is a problem because of their illegal or security issues, which it is not only about Baha'is, about Muslims, about Shia, about even about the majority of Muslims. They have been arrested. It doesn't mean every Baha'i, if is arrested, is definitely innocent because he's minority. It is not really the case. I don't know about their cases, the security or judiciary cases, but the position of judiciary is very clear. They say we respect all rights. If anyone of Baha'is they have been arrested, it is not because of their civil rights.
I could just add that there's a long time practice of discrimination against Baha'is by the Islamic Republic. And they are discriminated against in education, housing, employment, and this is well-founded. So, yeah, right there.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm Majid Fani, Iranian American. If you allow me make a comment and then mention my questions.
Quickly, because we're running.
And the comment is there are similarities between Ahmadinejad and Donald Trump. I remember once Iranian foreign minister was in a foreign trip, and then in the middle of the trip, Ahmadinejad fired him.
I remember, yeah.
And the man in the White House in the past 8 months, he has fired Comey all of a sudden. Once he invited him and said, oh, you are a nice police chief, and then next day he is fired. He fired his chief of staff, he fired his national security advisor, he's fired his spokesperson. And this is sad that we are all sitting here for talking about the future of this agreement. All these representatives of Western governments like European unions all are in favor of JCPOA, and everybody is waiting if this man wants to tweet yes or no. I hope we had a sort of logic in the decision making of the government, so nobody is rest in something totally unknown.
Do you have a question for our
Okay, my question for the two ambassadors of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, I mean the one who are representing them. My question is, how do you justify this contradiction? Turkish people were the government of Turkey was inside of the enemies of Assad. They were supporting ISIS. Same thing with Saudi Arabians, they were supporting ISIS. And speaking of hegemony, and the gentleman, Mr. Hussein Ibish, tried to translate or explain the word of hegemonic means to dictate your policy and power. Who was dictating his policy to Qatar? Who was supporting Saddam Hussein during 8 years of war when he was using chemical weapons?
All right.
Who is supporting the government of Bahrain?
We've got it. Let me give these two gentlemen a chance to respond.
I mean, these are siding with failed policies in the Middle East. And
okay. Halas, wait a minute. Go. Yeah. Do you have any comment? No, no comment.
Turkey
has been nominated as ambassador.
Yeah.
Ambassador from Turkey. I would love him to be the ambassador.
Yeah, I'll take that. I mean, Turkey supports ISIS was a talking point that many used, but it just doesn't have much grounding in reality. We can discuss the evolution of the Syrian crisis. I can spend a couple minutes if you're willing to. But it did start with as an uprising. It looked like at some point, like Bosnia, it could, the regime looked like it was gonna fall. There was the U.S. red line. etc. At some point, Russia and Iran got involved militarily. They put their people there, and then you ended up with several different regional countries with their pro forces on the ground in a fractured situation. It went from an opposition versus regime dynamic to a fractured country, essentially a failed state right now, with many different powers with zones of influence, including Iran and others. And then you had the insertion of the element of terrorism. A lot of Al-Qaeda people, there was this prison break, they fled to Syria. Over time they found an opening, sort of a vacuum there that they filled, etc., etc. We can go on about how Al-Qaeda found a lot of, it matured into, sort of transformed into different forms, but in this process Turkey did support groups that were against the Syrian regime, and Iran supported the regime, but those opposition forces, because of failures on the side of Turkey, US, EU, they couldn't develop a common sort of one unit of opposition, and then by then the terrorist groups, including ISIS and others, dominated the ground, and then it turned into a counterterrorism operation, which Turkey is part of, and Turkey, did a lot on that front. You can blame it for being a little bit late in picking speed, but there's no real sort of, there's no, I would say, factual grounding. I mean, how do you I express it better early, but anyway.
You did a good job. Let me just say, for my own part, I mean, I think that's good. We could talk about how the Assad regime described the terrorist onslaught as a fictional reality before it ever happened, and then worked 24/7 for years to create it and to ensure that it dominated the opposition, and they were very successful in that. But more to the point, you began by describing it as ambassador from Saudi Arabia, and your question, the underlying premises of your subsequent questions did not get any more reasonable or fact-based than that assertion was. So.
Leave it at that. Hussein, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, on Iran-Turkey relation, the relation is really much better than what was described here. Iran and Turkey, they have lived in peace for 400 years, no war. The economic relation has not been changed, increasing constantly. There was Iranian-Turkish dispute in Syria, no doubt about it. But they are getting now in much better situation. The most effective international regional mechanism now is working to manage Syrian crisis is Russia, Iran, Turkey. The other coalitions, they are really almost nothing. On Qatar, Iran and Turkey, they are in the same boat.
Right.
On Iraq, Iran and Turkey, they are in the same boat. Therefore, the relation is really much, much better than what has been described. Is totally different with relation with Saudi Arabia or Emirates.
True. Okay. We are out of time. I think you've all been very patient. I thank those who've been here for the whole afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.